The sympathy cards were still stacked on the kitchen counter, unopened, when my stepdaughter walked into my living room and told me she'd hired a moving company. Not for herself, for me. Please subscribe to the channel to see what happens next. I want you to really understand that sentence before I continue, because I think it says everything you need to know about the kind of people I'm dealing with. My husband, Raymond, had been gone for 4 days. 4 days. The smell of the hospital, that particular combination of antiseptic and loss, was still in my hair. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since he'd passed. And Renata, his only daughter from his first marriage, sat across from me in the armchair Raymond used to read in, his armchair. In our living room, in the home we'd shared for 31 years, and told me the moving company was available the following Thursday. "I thought it would be easier for you," she said, in that particular tone she had. The one that sounded almost caring if you didn't know her. "Starting fresh somewhere smaller. Somewhere that's really yours." Her brother Derek was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her do the talking the way he always did. Derek was 43, 2 years older than Renata. He was heavy-set and quiet, with Raymond's jaw and none of Raymond's warmth. He'd driven up from Phoenix the morning after his father's death. Not the night of, the morning after. I set down my coffee cup. "I see," I said. And then, because I was 64 years old and had lived long enough to know that some conversations needed to end before they truly began, I told them I needed a few days to process everything and asked them to come back on Friday. They agreed. They were very gracious about it. That should have been my first warning, that they were too gracious. Too patient. Too willing to give me those few days without pushing. People who are confident they've already won can afford to be patient. I met Raymond Calloway at a conference in Denver. The autumn I turned 32. I was working in hotel event management at the time, and he was there on behalf of the construction firm he co-owned with a partner named Harold. He was 51 and recently divorced, and he had the kind of stillness about him that I associated, at that age, with men who had survived something. He asked me to dinner. I said no twice before I said yes. By the end of the second dinner, I understood that the stillness wasn't sadness. It was patience. Raymond was the most patient man I had ever met in my life. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony at a ranch outside of Taos. Derek was 17 and didn't come. Renata was 15 and stood in the back with the expression of someone enduring something unpleasant. Raymond had told me, before we were even engaged, that his relationship with his children was complicated. What he meant, I would learn over the years, was that his ex-wife had spent nearly a decade after their divorce teaching their children to view their father as an adversary and anyone associated with him as a threat. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I was patient with Renata the way Raymond was patient with everything. I remembered birthdays and graduations and the names of her college roommates. I sent care packages when she was struggling, called when she was sick, showed up to things I wasn't technically invited to because Raymond asked me to and because I wanted his family to be my family. For 31 years I tried. And for 31 years, I was made to feel like a visitor in my own marriage. So when Renata sat in Raymond's armchair 4 days after his death and told me she'd hired a moving company, I wasn't surprised. I was tired. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from deciding, somewhere along the way, that hope costs more than it's worth. I'd been carrying that tired for a long time. What I didn't know, sitting there with my cold coffee and my unopened sympathy cards, was that Raymond had known too, and that he'd spent the last 14 months doing something about it. They came back Friday morning as agreed. This time they brought an attorney, a young man named Preston who worked at a firm Derek had apparently retained 2 months earlier. 2 months earlier, while Raymond was still alive, while I was sitting in hospital waiting rooms doing crossword puzzles and pretending I wasn't terrified. They arranged themselves across from me at the dining room table. Preston opened a leather portfolio and began talking in the measured, gentle tone that attorneys use when they want to make devastating information sound like ordinary paperwork. The will, he explained, was straightforward. Raymond's estate, which included the primary residence in Scottsdale valued at approximately $940, a beach house in Rocky Point, Mexico, valued at $680, and various business interests in the construction company totaling an estimated $550, was to be divided between Derek and Renata as sole beneficiaries. For me, Raymond's wife of 31 years, the woman who had managed his household, entertained his business partners, driven him to chemotherapy appointments, and held his hand through 2 surgeries, there was a life insurance policy. $150. I watched Preston's mouth continue moving and I heard the individual words, but I was having difficulty assembling them into meaning. The beach house in Rocky Point, where Raymond had proposed to me properly, with a ring he'd had custom made. The house in Scottsdale, where we'd planted a lemon tree the first spring we lived there and where that tree now produced more lemons than 2 people could ever use. The business Raymond and Harold had built over 40 years. All of it, to Derek and Renata. There are also, Preston continued, with a slight clearing of his throat, some outstanding financial obligations from Raymond's medical treatment. The insurance covered the majority, but there remains approximately $160 in balance due. And those obligations, I said quietly, fall to me. As his spouse. Yes, that's typically how these situations are structured. I looked at Derek. He was studying the tabletop. I looked at Renata. She met my gaze for approximately 1 second before looking away. $150 in assets. $160 in debt. A net outcome of negative $10,000 and 30 days to vacate the home where I'd lived for 3 decades. All right, I said. Preston blinked. I'm sorry? All right, I'll sign whatever needs to be signed. I'd like a copy of everything for my own records. And I'd like the moving company your sister mentioned to be available in 3 weeks rather than 1. I'll need time to pack Raymond's personal belongings carefully. The silence around the table lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. You're not going to contest anything? Derek asked. No, I said. Family harmony is more important to me than legal battles. They looked at each other. And in that look, the quick, satisfied, slightly incredulous look of people who expected resistance and got none, I saw exactly what they were. Not grieving children, not even particularly angry ones. Just greedy. Simply, straightforwardly greedy in the way that people sometimes are when they've spent years believing something is owed to them. We appreciate that, Vivian, Renata said. The warmth in her voice now that she'd won was almost impressive. We really do. Dad would be grateful. I smiled at her. I had become very good, over 31 years, at smiling at Renata. I'm sure he would, I said. I found the key 11 days later. I was going through Raymond's winter coats, the ones hanging in the back of the master closet. The ones he hadn't worn in 2 years since his health had started its long decline. I was folding them carefully into donation bags because Raymond believed strongly that quality things should be used rather than stored. And because keeping busy was the only way I'd found to get through the days. The key was sewn into the lining of his old wool overcoat. Not zipped into a pocket. Sewn in, with what looked like dental floss, neat, deliberate, patient stitching that could only have been done by someone who wanted it hidden but found. Found eventually, by the right person. By me. The key was brass, small, stamped with a number, 412, and on one side. Barely legible in fine engraving, Southwest Secure Vault, Scottsdale. I sat down on the edge of the bed. Raymond, I thought, what did you do? I went to Southwest Secure Vault the following morning without telling anyone. The facility manager was a heavy-set man named Gerald who shook my hand firmly. Checked my ID against the account records twice, and walked me back through 3 sets of locked doors to a private viewing room the size of a large closet. The box was heavy. Inside, a manila envelope labeled "Open this first" in Raymond's handwriting. Beneath it, 3 additional folders, each labeled in his careful block print. A smaller envelope that looked like it contained a USB drive. And at the very bottom, a single business card for an attorney named Margaret Voss, with a handwritten note that said, "She is expecting you. Everything is ready. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading the first envelope. The letter inside was 8 pages. Handwritten. Dated 14 months ago. Raymond's handwriting had changed by then. The tremor in his right hand made the letters uneven, but the voice was entirely his. Patient, precise, quiet in the way that things are quiet right before they make a very large sound. My darling Vivian, it began. If you've found this, then things have gone the way I was afraid they might. I want you to know first that I am so sorry that I couldn't protect you from what's coming in the ordinary way. Sorry that I left you to face it alone. And sorry that I spent too many years believing that love would be enough to change what fear and resentment had built in my children. It wasn't. I see that clearly now. I also want you to know that you are not as alone as they want you to believe. He went on for 8 pages. I read every word twice. By the time Gerald came to check on me an hour later, I had read through 2 of the 3 folders and taken photographs of every document with my phone. The picture they assembled was methodical and damning. 14 months ago, Raymond had hired a private investigator named Carl Beaumont to look into his children's financial activities. He'd grown suspicious, he wrote, after overhearing a phone conversation between Derek and someone named Ferris, a name that appeared repeatedly in the investigation report, that referenced the Scottsdale property and the timeline, in ways that made no sense if Derek was simply discussing his father's estate in the abstract. What Beaumont had found was not abstract. Derek had, over the prior 18 months, borrowed $310 against future inheritance expectations from 3 separate private lenders. The loans were structured informally, the kind of arrangements that work only if the collateral actually materializes. Derek had been so certain his father's death would produce a substantial inheritance that he'd essentially spent it in advance. The lenders were not patient men. Renata's situation was different but equally revealing. She had been, for the past 2 years, quietly pressuring Raymond's business partner Harold into side agreements that would have given her a controlling interest in the construction firm upon Raymond's death, agreements Harold had agreed to under what Beaumont's report delicately described as significant personal and professional pressure, and which Harold had subsequently, according to a notarized statement included in the folder, signed under duress. Harold, it turned out, had been waiting for someone to ask him about this. The notarized statement was dated 6 weeks after Raymond's diagnosis. But the most important document in those folders was a copy of a will. Not the will Preston had read to me across my dining room table. A different will, dated 7 months ago, executed at Margaret Voss's office in North Scottsdale, with 2 independent witnesses and a notary, at a time when Raymond's physician had documented, in writing, in a letter included in the folder, that his patient was of entirely sound mind and full legal capacity. This will left everything to me. Not most things, everything. The house, the beach property, the business interests, the investment accounts that Derek and Renata apparently didn't know existed, 3 accounts at separate institutions, the combined balance of which was $3.2 million, a second life insurance policy for $400, separate from the one they'd mentioned. The entirety of Raymond's estate was, under this document, mine. Derek and Renata were provided for with annual trust distributions, modest, structured, and controlled by an independent trustee, that would pay out over 15 years. Enough to live on, not enough to waste. And there was a clause at the end that I read 4 times because I wasn't sure, initially, that I was reading it correctly. I leave to my wife Vivian the full discretion to determine what, if any, additional consideration my children Derek and Renata shall receive from my estate, including the right to gift them either or both of the primary properties described herein. This discretion is hers alone, to exercise according to her own judgment and her knowledge of their conduct. He left it to me to decide. He left me the power to give them what they actually deserved. I called Margaret Voss from the parking lot of Southwest Secure Vault. She answered on the second ring, and I had the sense, from the tone of her voice, that she'd been expecting my call for a while. "Mrs. Calloway," she said. I'm so glad you found everything. How are you holding up? I'm managing, I said. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of answers. Can you come in this afternoon? Margaret Voss looked exactly like someone you'd want in your corner in a legal dispute. She was 60-something, silver-haired, with reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose and a desk covered in organized stacks of papers that somehow communicated absolute competence. Her office was warm and slightly cluttered and smelled faintly of coffee and books. She walked me through everything in 2 hours. The will Derek and Renata had presented, the one Preston had read to me across my dining room table, was a version Raymond had revoked 14 months ago. Shortly after he'd first hired Beaumont and begun to understand what his children were planning. The revocation was on file. The new will superseded it entirely. There was no legal ambiguity. The two real estate properties, the Scottsdale House and the Rocky Point Beach House, were also. Margaret explained, somewhat different than they appeared. Raymond had taken out substantial mortgages on both properties in the past year. The house carried $1.1 million in liens. The beach house carried $620. Combined, the two properties were worth approximately $1.62 million. Combined, the debt attached to them was approximately $1.72 million. If someone were to inherit those properties, they would inherit a net liability of roughly $100, before accounting for maintenance, taxes, and the carrying costs of mortgages they almost certainly couldn't service given their existing financial situations. The money from the mortgages, the entire $1.72 million, had been moved into a protected account. My account, an account only I could access. Added to the $3.2 million already in the investment accounts. The $400 second life insurance policy. And the business interests, which Margaret estimated were worth closer to $700 than the $550 Preston had cited. The total picture of Raymond's estate was something in the vicinity of $6 million. None of which Derek and Renata had any claim to, under the real will, except through my discretion. What they showed me, I said slowly, that old will, they knew it was outdated? Margaret chose her words carefully. I can't speak to what they knew or when they knew it. What I can tell you is that Raymond was very deliberate about keeping the new will entirely separate from his previous attorneys. There is no way they accessed it through official channels. But they might have known a newer will existed? It's possible, which might explain, she said, why they were so eager to move quickly. I thought about Preston's leather portfolio. About the moving company Renata had mentioned 4 days after the funeral. About Derek, driving up from Phoenix the morning after his father's death. They'd known time was working against them. They just hadn't known exactly how badly. Margaret, I said, what are my options? She leaned forward and folded her hands. You could do nothing further, simply assert the real will, take possession of the estate, and allow the trust distributions to proceed as Raymond specified. Derek and Renata would have no recourse. Or you could choose to gift them the properties, as Raymond's will allows you to do, at your full discretion. She paused, with all associated encumbrances, of course. With the mortgages, she confirmed, they would own properties with negative equity. No bank would refinance them given their existing debt profiles. We've pulled their credit as part of the background work Raymond commissioned. They would be looking at foreclosure within 6 months. And Harold's situation? The side agreements Renata pressured him into? Carl Beaumont's report, combined with Harold's notarized statement, constitutes substantial evidence of coercion. If you wanted to pursue that through civil or even criminal channels, you'd have a strong foundation. I sat with all of it for a while. Outside Margaret's window, the Scottsdale afternoon light was doing what it does in October, turning everything gold and slightly unreal. The way the desert does when it isn't trying to kill you. Let me ask you something, I said. In your professional opinion, what would Raymond have wanted? Margaret smiled slightly. I drafted that will, Mrs. Calloway. I watched your husband write out his instructions by hand and then dictate them to me for 3 hours. I know exactly what he wanted. She paused. He wanted you to be safe. And he wanted his children to understand that the choices you make have weight. Even if the lesson is painful. Especially then. I asked for 1 week before we moved forward with anything. There were 2 reasons. The first was that I needed time to think through what I actually wanted, not what felt satisfying in the abstract. Not what Raymond had planned, but what I, Vivian Calloway, 64 years old and newly widowed, actually wanted my life to look like on the other side of all of this. The second reason was that I thought Derek and Renata deserved the chance to show me who they were when the pressure was on. They did not disappoint. The text messages started the day after our Friday meeting, when Preston had apparently gone back to them and reported that the signing had gone smoothly and everything was proceeding as planned. They were gracious texts, at first, checking in, asking how I was managing, suggesting we get together for dinner soon. By Wednesday the tone had shifted. Derek, Vivian, Preston mentioned you've been meeting with another attorney. Just want to make sure no one's taking advantage of the situation. These estate things can get complicated and there are people out there who prey on grieving spouses. Renata, Colleen mentioned you've been looking into Dad's financial records. We'd love to help you sort through whatever you found. Some of those old documents can be confusing. And then, Thursday evening, a voice message from Derek. He'd clearly been drinking. His voice was loose and impatient in the way that voices get when the performance of consideration has become too exhausting to maintain. Vivian, listen, we need to wrap this up by end of week. I've got commitments on my end that are contingent on the estate distribution. And I need you to get whatever you're doing with that other attorney sorted out and proceed with what we already agreed. I think you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Dad would want us to resolve this cleanly. Dad would want. I listened to the message 3 times. Then I called Margaret and told her I was ready. We held the meeting at Margaret's office. It had been her suggestion, neutral territory. She'd said, with a faint smile that suggested she'd done this before. They arrived with Preston, who had apparently figured out by then that something had shifted, because he walked in with the careful posture of a man who was no longer certain of the landscape. Derek was trying to project confidence and mostly projecting anxiety. Renata had dressed very carefully, the kind of careful that announces effort, and the effort itself told me something. Margaret and I were already seated. Carl Beaumont, the investigator, sat quietly near the window. His presence alone seemed to register with Derek, who glanced at him once and then looked deliberately away. Margaret began. She was precise, thorough, and entirely without theater. She laid out the existence of the later will, its legal validity, the documentation of Raymond's mental competency at the time of signing. She explained the revocation of the earlier document. She presented the investment accounts, the second insurance policy, the full picture of Raymond's estate. She did not raise her voice once. Preston, to his credit, did not try to bluff. He asked to examine the documents. He examined them for several minutes. Then he set them down and sat back and said nothing. Derek's face went through several stages. Disbelief, calculation, something that might have been. Very briefly, shame. Renata looked at me, just at me, not at Margaret or the documents or Preston. At me. You knew, she said, when we were here Friday. You already knew. No, I said honestly. I found the key the following week. But I suspected there was something I was missing. And now? Now I know everything. The silence stretched. Preston leaned over to Derek and said something quietly. Derek shook his head. Preston said it again. Derek made a short, frustrated gesture. What do you want? Renata asked. Her voice was flat. The performance was over. I want to honor Raymond's wishes. I said. He worked very hard on this. He thought about it for a long time. I think that deserves respect. Meaning what, exactly? Margaret slid 2 documents across the table. One toward Derek, one toward Renata. Gift deeds, she said. Mrs. Calloway has chosen, in accordance with Raymond's will, to gift each property to you. The Scottsdale house to both of you jointly. And the Rocky Point property as well. She is giving you exactly what you came here to take. They looked at the documents. Preston looked at the documents. I watched Preston's face as he read the attached financial disclosures, the mortgage schedules, the lien documentation, the carrying costs. Preston's expression didn't freeze. It went very still, very carefully still, in the way that expressions do when someone is trying not to let anything show. He looked up at me. I looked back at him. The mortgages, he said. Transfer with the properties, Margaret confirmed pleasantly, as they always do. Derek grabbed the documents. His eyes moved fast across the numbers. I watched the moment he understood, not just the numbers but the shape of it. The deliberateness of it, the fact that his father had done this on purpose and that the woman across the table had chosen to complete what his father had started. He planned this, Derek said. His voice was strange, almost wondering. He loved you, I said, in his way, but he loved me too. And he was a very patient man. There were things that happened in the following weeks that I won't dwell on at length, because the details matter less than the shape of them. Preston advised Derek and Renata not to accept the gift deeds. They accepted them anyway. Derek because he was desperate and still believed, somehow, that he could find a way to make it work. And Renata because refusing felt like admitting defeat in a way she wasn't ready for. Within 90 days, both properties were in foreclosure. Harold, Raymond's business partner, pursued civil action against Renata for the coerced agreements she'd pressured him into. The case settled out of court, but the settlement cost her considerably more than she'd expected. The private lenders Derek had borrowed against his anticipated inheritance were not understanding about the change in circumstances. I don't know the specifics of what happened there, and I'll be honest, I made a deliberate choice not to look too closely. I moved to a small town on the Oregon coast in the spring. I'd driven through it once, years ago, on a road trip with Raymond, and I'd said then, half joking, half not, that it looked like a place where things made sense. Raymond had agreed. The house I bought there had a workshop Raymond would have loved and a garden that needed everything. I spent the first month just learning what was growing. The second month I started planting. By summer I had tomatoes and zucchini and a climbing rose that had needed serious pruning but was, under new management, doing quite well. I took a watercolor class at the community center. I became a regular at the local farmers market. I joined a book club that met on Thursdays and read things I'd been meaning to read for 30 years. I was not unhappy. I was, for the first time in a very long time, simply myself. 8 months after Raymond's death, I received a letter from Renata. It was handwritten, 3 pages, and it was not asking for anything. I'll give her that. She didn't ask for money or forgiveness or for me to intervene in the situation with Harold or speak to Derek's lenders. She just wrote. She wrote that she understood. Now, some things about her father that she hadn't understood before. She wrote that she thought she'd been angry at him for a long time for reasons she'd never fully examined. She wrote that she was sorry, not in the big theatrical way, but in the small careful way of someone who isn't sure the word is adequate but is trying it anyway. I read the letter several times. I didn't write back immediately. I let it sit on my desk for almost 2 weeks. Then I wrote back, not a long letter, 2 pages, 1 side each. I told her what Raymond had been like during his illness. Not the medical details, but the other things, the crossword puzzles, the way he'd ask about the lemon tree even from the hospital bed. The things he'd said about her when she wasn't in the room, not angry things. Not bitter things, but hoping things, that she'd find her way, that she'd figure out the things that mattered. I don't know what Renata did with that letter, but I know what I did with hers. I put it in the folder where I keep Raymond's things, the letters he wrote me, the photographs, the notes he left on the kitchen counter for 31 years. It belongs there, I think. It's part of the same story. I established the Raymond Callaway Foundation for Financial Literacy the following autumn. Its focus is on educating older adults, particularly widows and widowers, about estate planning, financial documentation, and how to protect themselves from the kind of pressure I'd been subjected to in those early weeks. Margaret Voss sits on the board. Carl Beaumont has connected us with several investigators who do pro bono work for elderly clients in financial distress. Harold made a generous contribution in Raymond's memory and showed up to the first annual luncheon with flowers. Which made me cry in a good way. The workshop Raymond would have loved is now, in fact, being used for something he'd have approved of. I've been building raised garden beds. Slowly, carefully, the way you build things when you're not in a hurry and you've got time to do it right. Some mornings I sit on the porch with my coffee and think about what it means to be taken care of by someone who knew, even at the end, that they were running out of time. Raymond was a patient man. The most patient man I ever knew. He planted something 14 months before his death and trusted that I would find it. That I would understand it. And that I would know what to do with it. He wasn't wrong. He never was. If this story reached you somewhere, if you recognized something in it, felt something shift, I'm glad. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far Raymond's story has traveled. And if you or someone you know is navigating something like this, alone, confused, being rushed into decisions you don't fully understand, please reach out to an elder law attorney in your area. You have more rights than they're telling you. And you have more time than they want you to think.